You think selling your family home and moving somewhere smaller is going to save you a clean £100,000. The estate agent tells you there's no capital gains tax on your main home, and that part is true. But there's a bill on the other side of that move that nobody mentions, a stamp duty land tax charge on the new property that could be £7,500, £10,000 or more. And if you're not expecting it, that number is a real shock. I've seen people go through the whole process, list the house, accept an offer, feel great about the equity they're releasing, and then sit down with the solicitor and realize they'd forgotten to calculate the cost of buying the next one. The numbers still work out, but they work out less well than expected. And that gap matters when you're planning a retirement on a fixed income. In this video, I want to walk you through 5 things worth selling before you retire, or at least thinking hard about before you commit. We'll start with the one that catches the most people off guard: the family home. Then we'll move to second properties, gifts to adult children, hobby assets, and finally something that isn't a physical asset at all, but it might be the most important one on the list. Stay with me. The numbers are straightforward, and by the end you'll have a clearer picture of what to do and in what order. Let's start with the good news. When you sell a home that has been your main residence, the profit is completely free of capital gains tax. That's called private residence relief, and it's one of the most generous tax breaks in the UK system. If you bought your house for £250,000 30 years ago, and it's now worth £500,000, you walk away with that £250,000 gain, and you don't owe HMRC a penny of it. That is real, and it is worth appreciating. But here's what most people focus on so hard that they forget to look at the other side. Stamp duty land tax, SDLT, is a tax on the buyer, not the seller. So it doesn't matter that you're using equity from a tax-free sale. The moment you buy your next property, SDLT kicks in based on the purchase price. There's no exemption for people who are downsizing. There's no relief for retirees. You pay it the same as anyone else. The current rates work in bands, and they've been at these levels since April 2025. You pay nothing on the first £125,000. Then 2% on the portion between £125,001 and £250,000. Then 5% on anything above £250,000 up to £925,000. So if you buy a smaller house for £400,000, which is quite modest in many parts of England, the calculation looks like this: 0 on the first £125,000. Then 2% on the next £125,000, which is £2,500. Then 5% on the remaining £150,000, which is another £7,500. Total SDLT £10,000. That's before you've paid your solicitor, your surveyor, or a single removal van. When you add those in, solicitor fees, searches, removal costs, an energy performance certificate, if the seller hasn't provided one, you're typically looking at another £3,000 to £5,000. So the real cost of that move is somewhere between £13,000 and £15,000 coming straight out of the equity you just released. That's not a reason not to move. But it is a number you need to know before you make the decision, not after you've already accepted an offer. I used to think downsizing was a straightforward, no-brainer. I even told my own parents to do it. Sell the big house, release the equity, simplify your life. And then I sat with them going through the solicitor's paperwork. The SDLT return arrived, and we nearly fell off our chairs. Not because the amount was ruinous, it wasn't, but because none of us had factored it in. We'd been thinking about the tax-free gain, and not about what the purchase was going to cost. That's an easy mistake to make, and it's worth knowing about before you get to that stage. There is one more thing worth understanding here. If you're buying a second home before you sell your current main residence, you'd normally pay a 5% surcharge on top of the standard SDLT rates. But if you're replacing your main residence and you sell the old property within 36 months of completing on the new one, you can reclaim that surcharge. So if the timing of your move creates a brief period where you own two properties. That doesn't necessarily mean you're stuck with the higher bill as long as the sale completes within that window. The broader point is this: the tax-free part of the transaction is real, but it only tells half the story. The friction costs on the other side, the SDLT, the professional fees, the moving costs, need to go into your calculation from the start. Work out what you'll net after all of those, and then decide whether the move makes financial sense on those terms. If you're a UK homeowner who's starting to think about retirement, and you don't want hidden costs eating into your plans, it's worth subscribing to this channel. I go through this kind of practical, numbers-based retirement planning every week. So if the main home isn't the clean win it's often presented as, what happens when you own a second property? That's where the real tax trap is, and it's considerably bigger than £10,000. A second property is a very different situation from your main home, and the difference matters a lot when you're thinking about retirement. If you own a buy-to-let, a holiday cottage, or any property that isn't your primary residence, private residence relief doesn't apply. When you sell, the profit is subject to capital gains tax. For the 2025 and 2026 tax year, the annual exempt amount is £3,000 per person, and the CGT rates on residential property are 18% if you're a basic rate taxpayer, and 24% if your income takes you into the higher rate band. Let's put some numbers to that. Say a couple, call them Margaret and Alan, own a buy-to-let flat they bought for £150,000. It's now worth £250,000, so the gain is £100,000. Because it's in joint names, each of them gets the £3,000 annual allowance, so £6,000 of that gain is tax-free. That leaves £94,000 subject to CGT. If their other income in that tax year keeps them in the basic rate band, the bill is 18% of £94,000. That's £16,920. If their income pushes them into the higher rate band, the rate is 24%, and the bill could reach £22,560. That's a significant sum, and it's one of the reasons why the timing of any sale matters so much. One option that couples often don't consider is spreading the sale across 2 tax years. If you exchange contracts in one tax year and complete in the next, each of you gets 2 sets of the £3,000 allowance. That's £12,000 tax-free between you instead of £6,000. It doesn't transform the number, but on a large gain, it can save a couple of £1,000s for no real cost other than a bit of careful timing. The harder question is whether to hold or sell at all. A lot of people keep a buy to let into retirement because it provides rental income. That makes sense on the surface. But the ongoing costs, maintenance, letting agent fees, insurance, potential void periods when there's no tenant, can eat further into that income than the headline rent suggests. And if you're relying on the property as a retirement asset, you're taking on single asset risk. A change in the local rental market, a difficult tenant, or an unexpected repair can have a direct impact on your finances at exactly the moment when you're least able to absorb it. Selling before you retire and reinvesting the net proceeds in a diversified pension or ISA wrapper doesn't automatically produce a better outcome. But it does remove a set of variables that are harder to control in retirement than they are when you're still working. That's the trade-off worth thinking about carefully. You'd think the hardest thing to sell would be a property, but the next item on this list is much more emotional, and getting it wrong can affect far more than just your bank balance. This one is harder to talk about, because it's not really about tax. It's about the pull most parents feel when they see their children struggling. A lot of people approaching retirement are thinking about giving money to their adult children, a deposit for a first home, help with nursery fees, or just some financial breathing room for kids who are finding things tough. The instinct is completely natural. If you've spent 30 years building assets, it feels right to share them with the people you care about most. But the way you give matters as much as the amount, and there are 2 risks that often go unnoticed. The first is inheritance tax. Gifts made within 7 years of your death can be pulled back into your estate and taxed at 40%. There is taper relief. The rate reduces after year 3, but for large gifts made in years 1 and 2, the full rate applies. So a £60,000 gift can become a £24,000 tax bill for your children if you die within that window. That's not what anyone intended when they handed the money over. The second risk is less well known, and it's arguably more serious. If you gift a significant sum and then need residential care within 5 years, sometimes longer, depending on the council, the local authority can treat that money as still being yours. The legal term is deprivation of assets. What it means in practice is that you'll have to fund your own care rather than receiving help from the council, even though the money is gone. I remember sitting with a couple in their late 60s. They'd gifted £60,000 to their son to help with a house deposit. 2 years later, the husband needed full-time care unexpectedly. The council assessed their finances and said the gift still counted as part of their assets. They had to self-fund the care home at around £50,000 a year. That £60,000 lasted just over a year. The family was devastated, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because nobody had told them this was a risk. I'm not saying don't help your children. That would be a pointless thing to say. But there are ways to help that protect both you and them. Paying nursery or school fees directly to the provider is treated differently from handing over a lump sum. It meets the same family need, but the rules around it are less punishing. If a loan is appropriate, formalizing it with a simple written agreement gives you options later. You can waive repayments gradually using the £3,000 annual gift exemption each year, which keeps things clean from a tax perspective and gives you a measure of flexibility if your circumstances change. The goal is to help in a way that doesn't leave you exposed. You worked for decades to build financial security. Protecting that isn't selfish. It's part of making sure you can actually stay independent for as long as possible. So the financial assets are sorted. But what about the physical stuff? The cars, the boat, the classic motorcycle in the garage. Those might be costing you more than you realize. This section is less about tax and more about clarity, specifically the gap between what you think an asset is worth to you and what it's actually costing you. Let's take a classic car. A lot of people in their 50s own one, something they bought as a project, or picked up when the kids left home, or held on to because it feels like a good inflation hedge. Say it's worth £25,000 on the market today, and say it costs you £1,500 a year to keep insurance, MOT, occasional maintenance, maybe a bit of storage. That £1,500 is a straightforward cash cost. But there's a second cost that doesn't show up on any invoice. If that £25,000 were invested in a straightforward low-cost fund, returning 5% a year after inflation, it would generate around £1,250 of real growth annually. That's capital you're not accumulating because the money is sitting in a car. Add the cash cost and the opportunity cost together, and you're looking at roughly £2,750 a year that the car is absorbing. Over 10 years, that's £27,500 on a single hobby asset. Now, if the car genuinely brings you joy and you've planned your retirement income so that you can comfortably afford to run it, that's a perfectly reasonable choice. Nobody is saying sell everything that gives you pleasure. But a lot of people haven't done that calculation explicitly. They know the car exists, they like having it, and they haven't really sat down and worked out what keeping it is costing them in actual money and lost growth. The second car is a simpler version of the same question. If you're both going to be at home most of the time in retirement, do you still need 2 cars? Maintenance, insurance, road tax, running costs on a second car you barely use can easily run to £1,500 to £2,000 a year, plus whatever the capital is worth if you sold it. For some households, it makes sense to keep 2. For others, it's a cost that's just never been examined. The action here isn't automatic. It's just to look at these things properly, to work out the real annual cost, including what the capital could be doing elsewhere, and then make a deliberate decision rather than leaving it by default. But there's one more thing to think about selling before you retire, and it's not a physical object at all. It's something much harder to let go of. Everything we've covered so far has been a financial asset of some kind, a property, money, a car. This one is different, and it's arguably the most important thing on the list to think about before you retire. According to Age UK, nearly 1 in 5 retirees report feeling lost or without purpose in the period after they stop working. That's not a small number, and it's not just about emotional well-being, though that matters enormously. It has a direct financial consequence. People who feel directionless in retirement tend to spend in ways they didn't plan for: a new camper van, expensive travel to fill the weeks, impulsive purchases to fill the hours. None of those things are wrong in themselves, but when they're driven by a feeling of emptiness rather than genuine enjoyment, they drain the retirement pot faster than the financial plan ever anticipated. The job you're leaving didn't just give you money. It gave you a structure for your days, a reason to be somewhere, relationships with colleagues, a sense of being useful. When you walk out on the last day, all of those things go with it. And a lot of people discover, a few months in, that they weren't really prepared for the gap that creates. This isn't about finding your passion. That kind of advice is often too vague to be helpful. It's about something much more practical, testing what your retirement actually feels like before you commit to it fully. A simple approach is what you might call a 90-day trial. While you're still working, start building something outside of work that gives you structure and a sense of contribution. Join a local club and show up regularly. Volunteer somewhere 2 days a week. Start a small project, a garden, a community role, something that produces a result you can see. The goal isn't to find the perfect purpose. The goal is to prove to yourself that you can find engagement and routine outside of work before you've made the transition permanent. You wouldn't retire without stress testing your financial position. This is just applying the same logic to your identity. It takes a few months, it costs almost nothing, and it could make the difference between a retirement that works well and one that quietly doesn't. Let's bring this together. 5 things worth selling, or at least examining seriously, before you retire. First, your main home. It's tax-free to sell, but factor in the stamp duty land tax on the new purchase and the full cost of the move before you commit to downsizing. Second, any second properties. Capital gains tax applies to these, and the rate and timing of the sale both matter. If you have a partner and you have some flexibility on when you sell, think about how to use both your allowances across 2 tax years. Third, gifts to adult children. Helping the next generation is a good instinct, but make sure the way you do it doesn't leave you exposed under the inheritance tax 7-year rule or the deprivation of assets rules around care funding. Fourth, hobby assets and the second car. Work out the real annual cost, what you pay in cash, plus what the capital could be earning elsewhere. Then make a deliberate decision, not a default one. And fifth, your identity. It's not a financial asset, but it behaves like one. Test what life looks like outside of work before you make the move permanent. None of these require you to give up everything. They just require you to look at what you have with clear eyes before retirement changes your options. If you found this useful and you want more of this kind of practical retirement planning, subscribe to the channel. I cover UK-specific tax and retirement strategy every week, the numbers, the rules, and how they work in real life. You don't have to sell everything, but you do have to sell the right things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.